Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Spagme Ahmed, and I'm a senior global policy advocate with the International Center for Research on Women, or ICRW, based in New York. I am so excited for today's event, In Pursuit of a Feminist United Nations, reflecting on progress and looking forward, co-sponsored by the Women's Major Group. So I have an incredible lineup of speakers today from across civil society, the UN, and government to discuss what a feminist UN system looks like, what we've achieved thus far towards that vision, and what remains to be done. So I'll welcome our speakers first and then provide a short introduction to contextualize the discussion. So I'm really pleased to be in the company of four amazing speakers, all of whom I really admire. Include Nahla Valji, Senior Advisor to the Executive Director at UN Women and formerly Senior Gender Advisor in the Executive Office of the Secretary-General. Desirée Cormier-Smith, Senior Advisor in the Bureau of International Organizations at the U.S. Department of State. Shehnaz Kimaz-Bechechi, Women's Major Group Coordinator. And Megan O'Donnell, Assistant Director of the Gender Program and Policy Fellow at the Center for Global Development. So before we kick off the panel and start talking about looking forward, I'm going to take us back to 2016 when the UN was selecting its next Secretary General. At the time, feminist advocates were calling for a female Secretary General to take the helm of the United Nations and to advance progress in areas that were most commonly overlooked in the UN's complex history. The General Assembly ultimately selected the now Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, who amplified his existing commitments to gender equality and declared himself a proud feminist, signaling interest in potentially embracing feminist reforms throughout the UN system. So realizing this opportunity, ICRW convened a group of feminist thinkers, advocates, and UN experts to imagine a transformative, progressive agenda for women's rights and gender equality at the United Nations. We called ourselves the Feminist UN campaign, or hashtag Feminist UN. And for 5 years now, we have been issuing annual report cards, grading Secretary-General Guterres on his progress against our feminist agenda. So this year at today's event, I'm excited to launch our 5th annual report on the Secretary-General, Time for Feminist Action and Implementation, giving him an overall B- on his work in 2021. The report card outlines progress in many areas and also points out areas in which the Secretary-General could improve as he embarks on his second term from 2022 to 2026. So the report card grades Secretary-General Guterres on 6 key areas as determined by the Feminist UN campaign. They include articulating and implementing a feminist leadership agenda, ensuring feminist implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, financing for gender equality, promoting gender parity and rights protections, supporting the Commission on the Status of Women and UN Women, and lastly, promoting freedom of information across the UN system. This year's report overall had a few overarching themes, including a need for more systemic accountability, transparency of information and access, and the need to push for intersectionality in gender initiatives and a more expansive understanding of what inclusion means in the UN system and its programming. So a lot more detail can be found in the report, but our panelists today will be discussing a number of issues integral to promoting a feminist UN system, including civil society engagement, advancing gender, racial justice, and intersectionality, fostering cohesion between local, national, and global efforts to advance the SDGs, ensuring adequate funding for gender equality, and promoting transparency and accountability for existing and future commitments. So I'll leave it at that so that we can get to our panelists, but if any questions arise throughout the event, please feel free to add them in the chat as we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So Nahla, I'd like to ask for you to start us off. So in 2021, the final year of the Secretary General's first term, he launched a major publication, Our Common Agenda, setting out his vision for the next 25 years. It includes major commitments to gender equality. So can you tell us more about these commitments made in Our Common Agenda and share an update on where they currently stand?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Spagme, for the invitation to be here today, and wonderful to see everyone logging in from all over the world. I'm very happy to give you an update on Our Common Agenda, and thank you for that introduction on the report card. I do hope that we're going to be able to come back and talk a little bit about the report card itself, and what's in it and what the plans are for the future of that accountability tool as well. Just to start with, in terms of our common agenda, as you said, a major report that came out last year. This was in essence a follow-up to the process of UN at 75, the listening exercise that took place around the world on the anniversary of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And coming out of that, the Secretary-General was asked to come up with a forward-looking agenda. And really his focus has been on a reinvigorated, inclusive, multilateral system. And of course, you cannot have inclusion without half the world's population there. And I think the Secretary-General has been very clear from day one, as you said. He calls himself an avid feminist, and has taken on first the institutional internal transformation that was needed to allow us to be stronger in achieving gender equality in everything that the system is doing. So the approach in our common agenda, I think, is one that is really strong on gender equality and a feminist vision. It has 5 transformative action points on gender equality. And essentially the Secretary-General has said, if we achieve these 5 issues, we will have transformed the world radically. And the first one is women's equal participation in every sector at every level of decision making. And utilizing temporary special measures and quotas to get us there quickly and ambitiously in the way that we need to. And I think we've particularly seen this in the last 2 years with the pandemic. We see the way in which women's leadership is different, brings the diversity of issues to the table that we need. And I think even just at the opening of CSW this week, the SG alluded to the fact that we would not be, that Ukraine itself is a reflection of marginalization in the global system. So the first is women's equal participation and temporary special measures. The second is the repeal of all discriminatory laws globally. The third is women's economic inclusion, including equal pay and the care economy. The fourth is making visible and central the voices of young women and young people more generally. And the fifth is ensuring that every single country has an emergency plan to address ending violence against women and girls and to deal with it as the emergency that it is, with the policies, funding, and political will behind it. But those 5 actions don't sit alone. They are also mainstreamed throughout the document. And before I get to that, just to say that in order to deliver on these, the Secretary-General has recommitted to internal reforms so that we are able to, as the UN system, deliver on them. And so within the internal reforms, a reiteration of its commitment to achieve parity at every level by 2028, a building of a tool that UNHCR and others have used, the age gender diversity tool, but taking that concept of applying an intersectional lens on the programming of the system. And the third is a gender review to ensure that this is the agenda of the system as a whole to deliver on gender equality. And then you see gender equality across the entire document, and you really see a feminist approach. And if I can just give you 2 examples here. The first is, well, actually 3 examples. So the first is on the economic piece. You'll see tax reforms explicitly looking at tax through a gendered lens and the differentiated impact on women. The second is the issue of rethinking GDP and linking that to the care economy. The fact that the hours of labor women spend every day have been invisible in our economic models and our economic metrics for so long. And then the new agenda for peace, which both calls for making women's security central to the conceptualization of peace. And it also calls for an overall reduction in violence. So moving away from the siloing of violence as criminal, political, domestic, violent extremism, et cetera, to seeing the linkages. And that, fundamentally, this is the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So again, the 5 transformative actions, the internal reforms to allow us to achieve that, and then the feminist and gendered underpinnings throughout the Common Agenda document. And I think I would just add 2 quick things. The one is to say that Common Agenda is not something new. It's not it really is about how do we deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals given the current context. Is the first thing. The second thing is this is intended to build on existing mandates and existing work. And so, for example, the work on temporary special measures, the work on discriminatory laws, this was already happening under the SDGs call to action on human rights. There was already interagency processes taking this to the country level. And so the idea is really just to say, what more do we need to do to really give the injection that we need to push the system forward on these issues.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nahla. That was so informative. Really appreciate everything you mentioned around identifying the priorities that the Secretary-General has identified, and also his efforts to integrate gender throughout his agenda. I'm particularly excited about your mentions of intersectionality, and I'm excited to see that work moving forward. So I think what you mentioned about reinvigorating multilateralism is a good transition for me to go to our next speaker. So I'm going to shift now to Desirée. As part of our efforts to advance the Feminist UN system, we're really eager to see commitments to intersectionality, gender, and racial justice, including and particularly from member states. So how is the US government prioritizing these issues in its engagement with the United Nations?
Well, thanks for that question, and thank you for having me in this really important discussion today. Let me first address racial equity, and then I will turn to intersectionalities between gender and racial justice. So the United States is committed to identifying and addressing the drivers of systemic racism and economic inequality. We continue to elevate and mainstream these issues throughout the UN, including at the UN General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, in our actions with the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and in other fora. The US is utilizing all tools available, including initiating messaging campaigns and proposing forward-leaning inclusive language in UN joint statements, interventions, and resolutions. We also organize side events to promote racial justice, and we're working with coalitions of other countries to support these efforts. The Biden-Harris administration has actively engaged on this issue in multilateral fora. For instance, during the March 2021 HRC session, we led a joint statement on countering racism and racial discrimination that 158 nations signed on to, a record high for any US-led joint statement. We strongly supported the August 2021 UNGA resolution establishing the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent. And we are proud that last December, Howard University law professor Justin Hansford from the United States was elected to the Permanent Forum as an independent expert for the 2022-2024 term. Additionally, we facilitated a visit to the United States by the Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues last November, and we look forward to welcoming the Special Rapporteur on Racism later this year. And we are proud to be partnering with Civicus, the Bunch Center for International Affairs at Howard University, and the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center at Howard University to hold a virtual side event on the margins of the Human Rights Council session on the importance of equity and inclusion of racial, ethnic, and religious minorities in healthy democracies. And intersectionality will be a key focus of that discussion. On intersectionalities, we recognize that while women experience discrimination on the basis of their gender, women of color face discrimination because of both gender and race. Women who encounter multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination must contend with additional barriers and forms of injustice. This is an essential truth that we reiterate across our engagement in the UN generally, and in UN bodies dealing specifically with marginalized groups. So the human rights of older women, Indigenous women, women from marginalized racial, ethnic, and religious groups, and women with disabilities are considered in the open-ended working group on aging, for instance, the Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues, and the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples, the Conference of State Parties to the UN Disabilities Convention, and of course, in the Commission on the Status of Women. And while the permanent forum on people of African descent has yet to be launched, we fully expect gender to also be a focus. Furthermore, we strive to insert language referring to these groups into negotiated UN documents, declarations, and statements. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Desiree. It's so exciting to hear about all these initiatives that the Biden-Harris administration is undertaking and the efforts to really link the commitment to racial justice, both between domestic and international. So thank you for outlining all of those initiatives. And especially as the CSW agreed conclusions negotiations are going on, we're really eager to see government support for intersectionality, gender, and racial justice. So appreciate you highlighting all of those. I'm going to shift next to our civil society speakers, as I'm sure they have a lot of great things to say. So firstly, Shehnaz, a major part of our report card is calling for progress against the 2030 agenda. So as we lay out, progress on achieving the SDGs is lagging, particularly due to the setbacks of the COVID-19 pandemic. So as we aspire for a more feminist UN, how can the UN system help reverse these setbacks and advance greater progress by 2030, particularly at regional, local, and national levels?
Thank you so much, Cormier, and thank you so much for including us as a women's.
Sorry, Shehnaz, your audio is a little bit low.
How is this now?
Much better.
Apologies, I'm coming from the UN to all of you, which we have had the pleasure of being able to access after 2 years. So it is, so apologies for the audio in that sense. Maybe I can start with saying that what the COVID pandemic has shown us is that in many realities which we have overlooked before, the pandemic made it more evident to the point that we couldn't deny them anymore. One of them was that the inequalities among and within countries are deeper than ever. And the other is that our crises are interconnected. One virus being probably caused by our ecological damage, wreaked havoc basically on our social and economic systems. So all our systems and all our crises are definitely connected. So when you actually think about it, this feels like the solution would be simple to devise, not necessarily simple to implement. But we would need to, this calls for the transformation of the systems that has caused and deepened these inequalities, making sure that we realize and respond to the connectedness of these systems. And we really hoped, in the sense of building back better, that the pandemic would actually lead us to these solutions, devising these solutions. But unfortunately, the pandemic didn't create this impetus towards transformative systems. We are sadly seeing the continuum of business as usual, which we know will not make us reach the SDGs by 2030. And in fact, with the pandemic, it has taken us back from some of the goals even further than before and during the pandemic. Of course, SDG 5 being one of the primary SDGs that have actually regressed in terms of progress over the course of the COVID pandemic. Of course,
Shehnaz, if you could just be a little bit louder, I think.
Of course.
That's much better.
Of course, not all hope is lost, but I think the need for action is imminent. I think the key is to listen to the people who are living with the effects of our systems day by day. Therefore, I'm thankful to your question that you've included the local level as well. We need to make sure to listen and respond to the realities of the people starting from the local level. And here I should emphasize once again that civil society is the venue through which these voices can be heard. That's why effective, meaningful, inclusive, and resourced participation of civil society in the UN policy spaces, as well as in the regional, national, and local levels, is a must, so that the work of the UN will cater to the needs of we the people, as the ideals of the UN was built upon. In this regard, maybe I should, as I've said in the beginning, I'm coming to you from the UN, and maybe we should touch upon the restricted and nearly non-existent access of civil society organizations to the UN buildings even after physical meetings resumed, apologies, during the pandemic. And this has been damaging to the work on the SDGs. Even during the CSW, while we're very happy and glad to be able to access the UN corridors again, the big caveat comes along that this was announced actually very late, only in the afternoon of last Friday. Only half a day before the official session started, half a work day basically. So that means that it's only this civil society that's based in New York, or those that could risk coming here and not being able to access the UN can be in this space right now. And for the past 2 years, the decision to close the UN doors to us has been a decision given about us without us. So if we were involved, it could have been possible to offer alternative and more sustainable solutions to the tensions between participation and, of course, the measures needed to be taken due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So now, as the methods of work resolution is being discussed at the CSW, I think one of the things I would like to bring from the SDGs space in general to all the UN spaces is the major groups and other stakeholders structure that actually gives us gives civil society important access to the policy making spaces where we can create changes towards the better for the people on the ground. It will definitely enable us, if this is replicated in other UN spaces, it can enable us to accelerate the progress towards the realization of SDGs via enabling more actors to work together and for us to learn from each other. And maybe since we're in CSW, the one thing that we can take from the CSW process, methods of work, would be the suggestion the chairs of CSW Bureau and the UN Executive Director each year repeats on including civil society in the delegations to the CSW. So this would be definitely very helpful for civil society to be included in the HRPF delegations as well, and hope there can be this mutual learning and impetus from this. Thank you so much, Spogme.
Thanks so much, Shanaz. Really second your call for effective, meaningful, and resource participation of civil society. I love the way that you phrased that, and also the really tangible recommendations that you gave on following the major groups and other stakeholders model in other UN mechanisms, and also making sure that civil society are part of member state delegations, not just at CSW, but other forums as well. So I'm going to shift now to Megan. So Megan, throughout the years, the Feminist U.N. campaign has been calling for increased financial commitments to gender equality. So what does financing for gender equality currently look like at the UN, and what more do you think is needed to ensure that funds are reaching women's rights organizations, feminist movements, and actors working to advance gender equality worldwide?
Thanks, Spogme, and thanks so much to my fellow speakers. I've really appreciated hearing from each of you so far. To take the first part of your question, as we think about gender-specific financing at the UN, I think we can apply a framework that many of us who think about gender financing across institutions often apply, which is to think in two buckets. So first about dedicated financing, and then about mainstreamed or integrated financing, right? And so, of course, the former is pretty straightforward, and we have great representation from UN Women as kind of the core agency with promoting a feminist approach as core to its mission. And luckily, there's a decent amount of transparency around the financing being provided directly to UN Women, as Nahla and her colleagues know even better than me. You can go into the 2019-2020 report, which I believe is the most recently available, and see their sources of revenue, the top contributors from country governments and those who are contributing less, their sources of expenditures, and then any surplus. I think it's important to contextualize some of the figures. As many of you may know, UN Women, when it was first launched as a dedicated agency, had this mission of getting to 500 million and then eventually 1 billion in its core funding. Unfortunately, it's been kind of a slow ramp up, where I've got data now just from a report that the Council on Foreign Relations released a couple of weeks ago that several of us fed into and advised. And they're citing that it was only in 2019 that 500 million mark was met. That number in the abstract may not tell us a ton. What does 500 million mean relative to some other UN agencies? So I think it is important to put it not just into historical, but into context in terms of comparisons to its peer institutions. And here we see that UNICEF, by comparison, got $7 billion in just 2020 alone. So I think it's clear that when we look at the dedicated financing, without necessarily commenting on what UN Women currently needs to achieve its core mandate, but just looking at it across the rest of the UN system and to see where it compares to the funding going to other agencies with other mandates, we can still see that it's ranking below some of its peer institutions. On the mainstreamed or the integrated part, this is a bit tougher to track, understandably, because you have to broaden the scope. But Spagme, you and others who worked on the report card do have data on this, which is interesting. We can see that 39% of agencies at least have a mechanism to be able to track gender-related financing in their activities and operations, but that so far just 27% of that financing does in fact consider gender. So room for growth and opportunity for progress there. I think one of the things that's going to allow us to drive increased and improved financing, which is just as critical going forward, focused on gender across the UN, I think actually will tie back to where Nahla started us, which is to tie the expenditures to the outcomes that we are seeking to achieve. So more and more, if we are not just thinking in the abstract about dollars and cents, but we are costing it out, right? We are developing a theory of change with figures that will necessitate X number of dollars for a GBV emergency plan in X country context, or X number of dollars to ensure that women and girls are participating in these decision-making processes, or X number of dollars to strengthen the global care economy, right? These are the types of figures I think that can be very meaningful in then being able to do even more fruitful analyses of, we don't just want more money, we want X number of dollars to fill the gap between the baseline and the ultimate outcome we're seeking to achieve. I think that's a good segue to the second part of your question, Spagme, which is how do we ensure that feminist movements, women's rights organizations, other relevant stakeholders are involved and included? It absolutely can't be that they are just a side endeavor or a tick the box, right? We have to meaningfully interrogate and validate how women's rights activists and feminist actors are critical to those 5 core objectives that Nahla started off the conversation with, right? How is their engagement with the UN system or at country level or even subnational level critical to the achievement of progress across those different areas? I will stop there, turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Megan. I feel like I learned so much in those few minutes, but I love the way you really articulated the difference between dedicated and integrated financing and the way you tied it into the importance of building out a theory of change and realizing what outcomes we want to see and how to finance for them. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to turn it back now to Nahla. So Nahla, as we outline in our report, civil society engagement is really an important aspect of achieving a feminist UN system. So my next question to you is, how will future UN reforms and initiatives, including those committed to an Our Common Agenda, help ensure that civil society is on equal footing to member states, UN agencies, and other stakeholders?
Thanks for that question, Spagme. And it's so important that we're talking about the role of civil society. I think that you see it in Our Common Agenda, the reinforcement and visibility for the role that civil society plays. There is a commitment there that every agency should have the entry point, the engagement with civil society. But I would say also that we need to look at what it is that we already have in the system that we can build on. UN Women, Megan, as you and others have mentioned, was in large part the creation of a civil society movement. The relationship that UN Women has with civil society is incredibly unique in the organization. And I think that we see UN Women using that space. Also, the discussions on civic space that we've been having, the guidance note that you see on civic space is really OHCHR UN Women's leadership to take that forward. So really saying that, you know, UN Women's relationship with civil society is not confined to gender organizations either, that there is a broad role that they are playing on the relationship with civil society, the positioning of the voice and visibility and the space on civic space more broadly. But I would also want to just share with you what I think is a good practice model that I'm hoping that we can build on, and we're certainly using this internally as a good practice. So one of my hats, as you said, Spog, may have returned to UN Women as the senior advisor to the executive director. I continue, however, to be the global coordinator of the Spotlight Initiative, which is directly under, it's an SG initiative and directly under the Deputy Secretary-General's leadership. And there, from day one, the role of civil society as the co-creator, co-decision maker, you know, deciding on the programs, designing them, implementing them, monitoring them at every level of decision making. In fact, just before this meeting, we had an operational steering committee meeting of the UN and the EU, and of course, civil society was there asking questions about what does this mean in this country? What is the role? You know, how are you ensuring that the funding continues to civil society as we go forward? And just to say, out of that, so Spotlight Initiative, a 500 million euro partnership on ending violence against women and girls, and almost half of the funds that we have programmed so far, so close to $150 million of the funds programmed so far, have gone directly to civil society organizations, of which the vast majority are national, local women's organizations. And that really demonstrates, this is an SDG model fund, and we are trying to use this as an example of shifting that relationship of co-creating, of having a real partnership with civil society, and as an SDG model fund, that we can then use this in other areas as well. So I say that just to say that we do have models and examples of good practice. And I think what's really important is that we're coming together around that to give that visibility, to give it lift, and to say that that needs to be the model that we're using elsewhere as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Nahla. Really appreciate what you mentioned about what exists in the UN that we can build upon and help improve, and also highlighting the Spotlight Initiative. It's interesting to hear that example following Megan's comments about financing, and see the priority that's been given to co-creation and partnership, as you've mentioned. So I'm going to shift back to Desirée again. So Desirée, I want to ask, how will the US government be working collectively with other member states as we talk about partnership and collaboration to advance gender equality at the UN? And how will the US support civil society engagement in key UN processes, including the CSW and other forums?
Thank you. We recognize that much remains to be done on gender equality and women's empowerment, and that governments cannot do it alone. Women and girls in all their diversity have wide-ranging needs and concerns, including on violence and public safety, discrimination, access to justice, political participation and leadership, economic self-sufficiency, education, health, nutrition, water, sanitation, a clean environment, and on and on and on. The United States takes a collaborative approach to address these challenges, and we believe that multilateral cooperation is essential to progress. So we partner with member states, UN entities, but also critically civil society organizations and others to advance women's human rights. We are also active in UN bodies working to improve the lives of women and girls in all their diversity. These include the UN General Assembly, CSW, the UN Commission on Population and Development, the Human Rights Council, the UN Development Program, UN Population Fund, UN Children's Fund, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and of course, UN Women. We also sit on the 41-member UN Executive Board and provide substantial financial contributions to the organization. For the current 2022 to 2025 term, the US is the 4th largest donor, and we hold one of the major contributor seats. Along with other major donors, we insist that UN Women institute strong evaluation, monitoring, and accountability measures. That ensures that funding leads to tangible, useful, and sustainable results, as many of the speakers have indicated is critical. Gender equality and women's empowerment is mainstreamed throughout the UN with bodies and mechanisms that consider specific groups of women and girls. For example, as I mentioned previously, the Open-Ended Working Group on Aging discusses the situation of older women. The Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues considers the concerns of Indigenous women and girls. And the Conference of States Parties to the UN Disabilities Convention examines the situation of women and girls with disabilities. The United States believes meaningful civil society engagement in the UN broadly and on gender issues specifically is vitally important. We have efforts underway on this current session of the CSW. Member states are negotiating 2 draft resolutions on the Commission's working methods, as speakers have noted, one for the 3-year period beginning in 2022, and a second text for the period beginning in 2025 that contains even stronger language on the importance of robust civil society participation in the CSW. As we all know, 2025 marks the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the 4th World Conference on Women. So we really want to take advantage of that moment. So the United States is working closely with like-minded nations to defend this wording against efforts to weaken it and to ensure the meaningful participation of civil society. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Desiree. Really encouraging to see everything that the US government is involved in the UN multilateral space. And I love what you mentioned about the US working with other member states to really advance civil society participation in the methods of work. So as civil society, we're really hopeful for some progressive outcomes on that end in these next 2 weeks. So I'm going to go now back to Shanaz for an interesting question. So Shanaz, in recent years, we've seen the rise of anti-rights movements in both at the UN and worldwide, threatening progress on gender equality, often interfering with negotiations, including at the CSW. So how can UN leadership defend against these voices and ensure that progress towards gender equality and progressive outcomes are not lost?
Thank you so much, Spagme. This is one of the issues that is of high priority for me because it.
Sorry, it's a little low again.
Okay, yeah. Sorry. Okay. So apologies for the visual, but at least the audio is hearable. So this is one of the issues that is of most importance to me personally, as well as the work we do, I think, as feminist movements in the UN space, because of its potential to undo what we have worked to build in the last decades. So I find it alarming that we don't have the emphasis we have and the urgency we have on to act against the anti-rights and anti-gender agenda, both within the UN space, but as well as with the member states, is a little worrying, is very worrying for us. And there was more, of course, reference to this pre-COVID days, and the wording used was pushing back the pushback. But unfortunately, although the movement's impact is increasing, we see reference to it a little less. And I think we need to start with understanding that these anti-gender and anti-rights movements do not only threaten gender equality. So it's not just a matter for feminists, but they threaten our planet, our social contract, and our health. These movements are not just found resisting against the rights of women and girls in all their diversity and LGBTQI folks, but they also deny climate emergency, they refuse COVID-19 vaccines, and they polarize our societies until we can no longer talk to each other. And furthermore, research on anti-gender movements show that they're incredibly well-funded, very well networked, and spaces are open to them via these networks. Therefore, their impact is increasing strongly. Unfortunately, disinformation and harassment is often rampant among these groups towards human rights defenders. And women's human rights defenders and environmental defenders are disproportionately affected on this. But we also see this being reflected, for example, in the violence, on digital or physical violence towards women parliamentarians, for example. And many times, in terms of the human rights defender, women human rights defenders, these can take life-threatening forms. And and basically destroy the lives of many of the defenders. So they're becoming a real threat in this sense. Unfortunately, neither our common agenda nor the recent speeches we hear are reflecting this emergency that's threatening gender equality, as I've said, our progress on SDGs, and more, and maybe more kind of fundamentally, our notion of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And they threaten to further unbalance the already unbalanced power relations among and within the stakeholders, including in the UN space. So our call to the member states and the UN leadership would be to make sure that they raise their voices against such remarks and to take a stance. They shouldn't negotiate human rights or gender equality away for other to make sure something else stays in a document, because human rights and gender equality are core and fundamental to anything and everything we do here. And please remind those who do put forward anti-gender and anti-rights narratives, remind them of the founding principles of the United Nations and the founding resolutions of CSW, the Agenda 2030 document, etc. These documents all refer to the fundamentality, the core of human rights and gender equality, but unfortunately, we're hearing opposition to them. One of the things that we know that the anti-gender, anti-rights movements are very insistent, and because they're much better funded than the feminist movements, so then their increase in numbers and their influence is definitely not a coincidence. But that insistence, of course, affects the way the United Nations also does work as well. So feel free to disregard them, and when appropriate, call them out as anti-gender, anti-rights movements, narratives, and actors. Consult your feminist allies and work together, as Nahla has mentioned, collaboration and co-creating together so we can overcome both the challenges of the feminist movements, but also to protect them and to stop these anti-rights narratives together. Please also support feminist movements financially. As I mentioned, the funding received by anti-gender and anti-rights movements is multiple folds of the funding the feminist movement receives, even after the boost in funding promises in the Generation Equality Forum. And please also allow me to remind again what Megan has said in terms of the funding UN Women receives being extremely small in comparison. And please, one last thing I would like to put forward for all of us, both for civil society, member states, and the UN leadership, is that there is an urgency to act against these groups and against these narratives. And they're not a threat just to women, girls, LGBTQI folks in all their diversity, but they're also a threat to democracy and law. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shanaz. You raised so many important points and appreciate the reminder of pushing back against the pushback and how we really want to urge UN and global leadership to stick to their commitments there. I love the call to action that you've raised. While we've seen a lot of progress towards gender equality in the past few years, violence against women's human rights defenders and against feminist movements worldwide is still a dire emergency. So we really do want to see member states, UN agencies, and others step up to make sure that we're reaching progress and that we're not regressing at all. So I'm going to direct my last question to Megan. So Megan, we've seen major commitments to gender equality, including at the Generation Equality Forum, in the SDGs, our common agenda, and by member states and UN agencies. So how can we ensure transparency and accountability for these commitments to gender equality?
Thanks, Bogme. I think one theme kind of cutting across so many of our responses to your questions has been the need to engage with and equip civil society actors with the resources they need to do their work most effectively. And I think when we're talking about generation equality, we're at this critical juncture where now I think we can all acknowledge the huge heavy lift that UN Women, the governments of Mexico and France went through to convene during a global pandemic, both virtually and, for some folks in person, to get us to a point where those commitments were made. Now, I think the rubber hits the road in making sure that civil society actors, those of us who are researchers, but also advocates, folks sitting on the outside of commitment-making institutions, to be able to track progress. And for that, we need data, and we need pretty specific data. And so when folks came together in June and July and made those commitments at the Paris convening of the forum, what we saw at first, for the data that was available, is that a lot of it was pretty amorphous. There weren't a lot of costed commitments. There wasn't a lot of information on timelines or specific actors who would be held accountable. And that's to be expected. It was still early days in what will hopefully be a much longer runway for the Generation Equality Forum process. But now, I think at this Commission on Status of Women convening, we are expecting more information that UN Women has been hard at work kind of behind the scenes to organize and to refine, so that we are anticipating the launch of this database that will detail commitments in more specific terms. And then from there, I think we're going to be on a positive road to be able to do more as we sit on the outside, to crunch those numbers, to be in touch with those actors, to hold them to account, to interrogate what they're doing to meet those stated goals. I think here too, it is critical to think about how the different parts can kind of add up to a bigger whole. There was incredible work done by the Action Coalition leadership, right? Focused on gender-based violence, technology, economic justice and rights, etc. And each of those coalitions came together to agree, I think each to 4 high-level goals, ambitious goals. So if you take economic justice and rights, there was a goal around the global care economy. There was a goal around poverty reduction. There's a goal around access to resources, right? For women as entrepreneurs, as wage workers, et cetera, as farmers. So as we think about each individual commitment, right, from each civil society organization, private sector corporation, UN agency, et cetera, I think we have to think carefully about how each of those is contributing to one of those bigger goals, so that we can be holding ourselves to account both at the micro level, kind of institution by institution, but also as a sort of collective community that convened through the forum, and think about how we're driving progress towards those ambitions that we've got 5 years to reach. So I'll end. Oh no, I'll add one more thing. Hopefully I have a minute. I think one important thing, and Nahla alluded to this earlier, is to remember that there are lessons to be learned from non-gender folks, non-gender experts, people who work on transparency and accountability, who don't have gender or feminist in their titles. And so I've done a lot of work personally over the years with the Open Government Partnership and those who fed into the creation, the launch, the continuation of the OGP. They have an independent review mechanism of experts at each country, interrogating commitments, making sure that they are made in specific enough terms to be tracked, making sure that they are followed up on and implemented. It's a platform, OGP, that uses carrots and sticks as incentive structures to ensure that we are applauding when countries do succeed in achieving their commitments, but we're also calling those out who have maybe been a bit lagging and slower to implement some of the commitments they've made. So looking to those models, I think, will be critical as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Megan, for really tangible recommendations. Appreciate everything you said about co-creation, accountability, transparency, and really reaching out beyond the gender community to learn, to take in lessons and best practices to how to improve our own work and commitments. So I think there's a lot of overarching themes throughout this discussion, mainly around collaboration and co-creation and the importance of inclusion and working across sectors to promote a feminist UN system. So we have some time for Q&A. Some questions have already been rolling in that we've collected, but if anybody has more questions, please feel free to throw them into the chat or into the Q&A function, and our team will collect them on the back end. So I'm going to start with one question that I think open to anybody whoever wants to take it, but a really helpful reminder that gender is not binary. It's not just men and women. So this question is, how can the UN take a more holistic view of gender, and what's in place to promote a more expansive view of gender as we talk about different commitments, initiatives, and civil society, member state UN collaboration?
I'm happy to take a first stab at that from the U.S. perspective. So, one of the things that the Biden-Harris administration has emphasized is that we look at gender equity and equality holistically. So that includes trans people, non-binary persons, and we have a whole of government approach to mainstream gender equity and equality, and that includes in our domestic and foreign policies. We also have a special envoy for the human rights of LGBTQI+ persons, Jessica Stern. She's the first woman to hold this position. She's a lesbian woman, and she and our teams in the multilateral space work side by side, or even closer than that, to try to mainstream this language. But I'm not going to be naive or lie to you and say it's been easy, right? But that doesn't mean we stop pushing. So we do push for the inclusion of language that includes all marginalized and vulnerable groups. And that includes members of ethnic, racial, and religious minority groups, indigenous persons, women and girls in all their diversity, LGBTQI+ persons. And we push and we push. But again, a lot of these documents, especially the ones that are consensus-based, we may not always win, but that doesn't mean we don't try.
Thanks, Desiree, for really candidly speaking about the issue. Does anybody else want to take that question? Shanaz?
I think Megan's hand was higher.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see it.
No, you go first and I'll follow you.
Okay, thank you so much, Megan. So I just want to
Sorry, a little bit louder.
I just wanted to kind of very briefly say the terminology matters, and defending the terminology matters. The UN is the space where we should aspire for the highest standards possible, right? So I think part of it is to be able to use the right terminology informed by what the movements are saying in all spaces. One thing that is, it's very valuable, the efforts to mainstream gender equality in all UN spaces, but it is only through being able to talk with each other. Because we're at the SDGs, we're very lucky that we do need to talk with a lot of different UN institutions to bring up the issues to those across those institutions. But I think there should be more cohesiveness, including with the UN human rights mechanisms in Geneva, especially to make sure that we always talk from a human rights-based gender equality approach for all, not, of course, not just for women, not just for girls, but for all, because gender affects the gendered stereotypes, affects all of us and damages of all of our lives. Thank you.
Just jump in to agree with Desiree and with Shanaz on the need for a narrative shift to be insisted upon, the political will, from the Biden administration and others who are sort of pushing this agenda from the top down, from their vantage points. There's also a data question, that's tied to this. And Desiree made such great points earlier about intersectional ways of thinking. It's going to require intersectional ways of disaggregating data more and more going forward, so that if we're not just thinking in binary terms, or we're not just thinking about even women and girls versus men and boys as these monolithic groups, but we're considering race, ethnicity, migrant status, disability status, etc., in order to know what works for whom, identify the policies, the investments, the solutions that are going to effectively target and benefit marginalized groups with these intersecting identities, we have to measure, right? Who is out there in our populations, and are they being reached, and are these solutions working for those more specific demographics? So certainly a research agenda to complement the political agenda.
Thank you, Megan. Oh, go ahead, Nahla.
Thanks, Bugme. Maybe just to come in here and say on a couple of things. So I think one, and this would be not just about this issue, but more broadly, we started this by saying it's so great to see civil society from all over the world, from so many countries here. And I think at the end of the day, we do have to recognize that the UN system was created as an intergovernmental space. And so, yes, there's lots that is happening to make it more inclusive, and that, our common agenda is very much about inclusive networked multilateralism, a vision for the future. But it's also important that we're putting pressure where we need to apply that pressure as well, and that is at the country level. That it is governments, and I think it is, as Desirée said, the commitments of the US and how they ensure that those are reflected. There's also pressure that needs to be put on member states to ensure that they are representing in the way that they need to at the UN in these spaces. But I would also say, just returning to the fact that we do have, again, tools that we can use. If you look at the SDGs, if you look at how deeply grounded that is in human rights, in the principle of leaving no one behind, the language of inclusion, etc., that we do have the tools there to push this door open. And I think we just need to think about how is it that we build on that to deliver in the way that we need to really align with that principle of leaving no one behind.
Thank you, Nahla. That's a very helpful reminder, and I think a good lead into this next question that I wanted to ask. Somebody raised the important point that, particularly this year, but every year, it can be difficult for folks to attend CSW as it's based in New York. There are cost implications, time implications, and also visa difficulties. And of course, now with the COVID-19 pandemic, that's become even harder. So what other suggestions do panelists have on how to advance advocacy and engagement at the country level, going off of what Nahla mentioned, but what are some other strategies that we can use to really build accountability at the country level to ensure greater progress that hopefully translates to the global level and the negotiations that are taking place in New York? So I'll leave that open to anybody who wants to jump in.
I'll just say the first thing that comes to mind, which is to build a bit on our previous conversation around the Generation Equality Forum. I am hoping, that there are plans in UN Women's leadership, but also across the Action Coalition leadership and membership to be starting to think in more region and country specific ways about how to drive the accountability agenda now that those commitments have been made. So I think obviously we all see virtues in a global convening of feminist advocates and others, who come to New York around CSW. Maybe that model should be interrogated in terms of the when and where and whom going forward, but certainly for generation equality, as we get very specific about progress over the next 5 years, could there be an opportunity to be thinking region by region, or even country by country, about who is organizing, who is convening, who's at the table to have these more in the weeds discussions about financing, about policy commitments and reforms and things like that.
Thanks, Megan. Desirée, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, if I could just briefly jump in. I mean, I think, and recognizing that this may be easier said than done in many places, but I would say a great starting point, particularly for civil society groups here in the United States, is to reach out to your governments, right? Let your member state and let your government know about the issues you care about and what you expect them to prioritize at CSW. ICRW is one of many groups that in advance of the CSW reaches out to the State Department quite persistently and actively to say, hey, we want to talk to you. The CSW is coming up. We want to hear your priorities, but we also want to share our priorities. And that puts us on alert, right? And we, I would hope that other member states are responsive. We make sure that we do civil society briefings and roundtables in advance of the CSW, as well as other UN bodies. So in advance of our return to the Human Rights Council, we made sure we had civil society briefings. And one of the things that I'm very adamant about is breaking down those silos. So making sure we aren't just talking to women's groups when it's about the CSW, but that we are including those groups when we're talking about our engagement at the Human Rights Council, when we're talking about our engagement with the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, right? And that we aren't just talking to, civil rights groups when we're talking about our engagement with the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, but we're also talking to environmental justice groups, and we're talking to the same feminist groups, right? There's so many intersectionalities that we have to make sure that we're having the same conversations, and that we really are broadening the table when we have these important conversations. And we're not perfect. It's going to take a long time for us to be sure that we are truly building inclusive spaces so that we can hear from everyone, but I can assure you that we are trying our best. And for those of you who are outside of the US, I would encourage you to reach out to your governments and their missions to the UN and their equivalents of the State Departments or the foreign ministries, to let them know that you are following the CSW. You would like to be a part of their public delegation. You expect them to advocate for these priorities and issues because that's what the women in your country care about. Democracies especially are meant to be working for the people. And so we have to be hearing from the people.
Thanks, Desiree. As a civil society advocate, that was music to my ears. So Shanaz, I'll pass it to you to jump in as well.
Thank you. Is it good? Is the voice good now? Perfect. I just wanted to say, I mean, it doesn't always come down to this, but it is very much about resourcing, both financial, but also in terms of opening up the spaces, giving up the possibility for people, like even including civil society organizations in the delegations, is a way of resourcing, not just financially, but for them to understand how the international system works and what rights and standards are there in the international system to bring back to their countries for national level advocacy, for legal change. So unfortunately, I will have to say resourcing, funding, yes, financial funding, very beginning, but there are also, of course, other ways to resource the feminist society, civil society. And it is very important, I think, to show what's happening in the international area. Many times the national movements are so overwhelmed trying to respond to what's on the ground. They're not able to follow what's happening on the international arena. And it requires a certain expertise, of course, to be able to, you need to know one of the 6 UN languages, you need to know how to access these mechanisms, you need to be ECOSOC accredited for many of the UN meetings. So making these ways kind of easier will also support the feminist movement at the national movements at the national level for future advocacy. Otherwise, they know their context best, and they are really, I mean, sorry, coming from a national women's movement myself, once upon a time, it is, I know they're doing their best and they're doing the best for their context. They don't know it better than we do, but they need the resources to be able to respond to those effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Shanaz. Such an important point on resourcing, and also really important lessons that I've learned from the Women's Major Group about how to translate progress and wins taken at the international level to the country level, and holding our governments to account to make sure they stick to their promises that they've made in multilateral settings, also in domestic settings. I have a question that I'm going to direct to Nahla. So Nahla, you, in your opening remarks, you had talked about the 5 key commitments that the Secretary-General makes to advancing gender equality in our common agenda outside of the other efforts to mainstream gender throughout the agenda. So the question is how to really ensure implementation of those 5 commitments, and anything more that you could say about implementation, accountability, and civil society engagement, and really advancing those moving forward.
That's a really great question, Spagme. I would say in terms of implementation of our common agenda, that has been moving forward already. There have been 5 thematic consultations that member states have held The President of the General Assembly has convened this, and the Secretary-General opened and closed it. And then on every issue, I believe that there was a UN panel with leadership in the morning, civil society partners in the afternoon engaging on these issues. So everything from the new agenda for peace to accelerating the SDGs, leaving no one behind. And so all of these have been discussed. What was really encouraging to hear was the consistent, strong support for the gender equality actions. In fact, almost uniformly across the board, all of the comments that were made on it were very positive. There were a couple of questions about the action plans, the emergency action plans on ending violence against women. That just needed clarity. But I would say almost uniformly there was very positive backing for this. I think also recognition that all of this is already there. Temporary special measures is in CEDAW, economic inclusion. It's there between Beijing, CEDAW, the SDGs, Security Council resolutions, etc. That we have the grounding that we need. Since our Common Agenda report was released, internally in the UN system, there's something like 90 actions that have been matrixed across the organization, with different parts of the House taking responsibility to drive it forward, but also to really connect across them. As I said, you cannot have a conversation on women's economic inclusion and the care economy without linking that to the conversation about GDP metrics, but also the accelerator on social protection and jobs. So really what's been taking place in the last couple of months is us getting our ducks in a row internally, and making sure that the actions are where they need to be. From UN Women's side, I can say that really ensuring that UN Women is supporting, inputting, driving where they need to for the system. The civil society piece, I think, will look different in each of those. So, as I said, the member state consultations have already had civil society as part of them, and as things move forward, the different pieces will have different roles and partnerships with civil society. But I think it's a really good point to come back to in terms of the 5 specifics. And what needs to happen there. I can tell you on the action plans for ending violence against women and girls that the spotlight agencies have been asked to take that forward. And so really we're trying to use this as a model. And of course, given that one of our core principles is civil society at the center of what we do, that will be the model that we will be that we will be sharing with member states for their own plans as well. So in short, different roles in different spaces, but I would really encourage that you're coming back to this and following up with the system.
Thank you so much, Nahla. That was really informative and helpful. I will just ask, I think, 2 more questions before we end for today. But as you know, as part of this event, we launched our 5th annual Feminist U.N. report card, grading the UN Secretary-General. So it's been an initiative that we've had for 5 years now throughout the course of the SG's first full term. So I think it's been useful in pushing a lot of progress in areas, maintaining an external accountability system. Now that the SG has kickstarted his 2nd term from 2022 to 2026, we have an opportunity to rethink this agenda, to think about what's useful moving forward. So I want to ask everybody on the panel, what recommendations do you have for us as the Feminist UN campaign and our future work in this area and accountability? What do you think we should focus on? What issues do you think would be useful for us to tap into, for the UN, for member states, for other actors to really advance on? So curious for your opinions there, and open the floor to anybody who wants to jump in.
Okay, maybe I'll kick things off, and I know that between, oh, sorry, Megan, go ahead.
No, you go first, I'll follow.
I mean, firstly, maybe just to say that the report card is such an important tool. There needs to be, and I think the SG himself has said, hold our feet to the fire. One of the first actions that we took on the SG's gender parity strategy was, in fact, developing a real-time database website where you can track entity by entity, level by level of the Secretariat, where things are at and how things have moved. So I think there's a real effort to say, and within the gender parity strategy, asking civil society to have a shadow report of the strategy, which is something that I think still needs to be taken forward. So there's a real encouragement of transparency and partnership around accountability, and I think that the report card is a really important tool on that. I would say this though, I think it's a tool that can be stronger. I don't think that it reflects an accurate understanding of the UN system. I think that it misunderstands, for example, the role of the SG. It holds the SG to account on things like CSW, which is with the member states. I think it also represents, the methodology is largely vested in perceptions. So asking, civil society in different parts of the world about their perceptions rather than an assessment. The people who are interviewed are almost exclusively gender advisors, and I would go back to a comment that one of the colleagues made that we need to move beyond just speaking to the gender folks about the gender space. I think that you'll see that this SG and this Executive Director of UN Women, and this Executive Director of UN Women has been very clear that she sees her role as bringing UN Women to the center of the UN system, for the UN system to deliver for women and girls. And so just looking at a handful of gender advisors and just assessing UN Women in the CSW space doesn't actually tell us about accountability of the system to deliver the large-scale political transformation and rights of women and girls that we need. So I would encourage a real relook at the methodology, the overall the overall philosophy that underpins this. And I think it would be important to update it. I think it would be good to reflect the vision of the Secretary-General and then say that there's other things that fall outside that. But I think it would also be a more useful tool if it were to say, these are the things that the SG has committed to, these are the things that the UN system has committed to, this is where they are falling short. Here are the additional things that we would also call for the system to include and consider beyond that. So I think some tweaking, some reorientation, some bringing on board. Again, we've had these conversations just looking at CSW rather than the Security Council, where you have 10 resolutions and huge gaps in implementation. That there are spaces where we're not looking where we need to be driving the bigger change that we need.
Thanks, Nahla. Megan, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I have, I think, one specific reflection, which is, the opportunity to maybe think clearly about what UN Women can and cannot do, and what the UN system of UN agencies can and cannot do. And also looking then one sort of concentric circle out to the broader multilateral system. Shanaz, hit home earlier when she mentioned the importance of resources, both financial and more broadly defined. And sitting at an institution that tends to interface most often, not actually with UN Women and other UN agencies, but with the international financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the other multilateral development banks, as well as the bilateral donor institutions, nothing would make me happier than to ensure that we are sort of narrowing the gap between the feminist advocates and researchers and civil society actors who tend to engage in CSW or forums like Generation Equality, but then don't think a whole lot about those other multilateral institutions with a lot of leverage policy-wise, with a lot of financial resources at their disposal. And so getting kind of a gender perspective increasingly to turn on some of those other institutions, and also making sure that it's a two-way street so that we're positioning kind of the gender champions within those institutions as partners and allies for those of us sitting on the outside, I think would be fantastic progress in a kind of new phase of accountability work. So wanted to flag that specific point.
Thanks. Thank you both for the feedback and for brainstorming ways to more collaboratively and productively work together to hold our institutions to account. I'm going to end with one last question. I'm going to keep it a little bit light. So CSW is an exciting time, but also a time with a lot at stake. So I'm just curious for all the panelists, what are you most excited about these next 2 weeks and what are you hoping to see in the outcomes? Go ahead, Shanaz.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, this is right. I'm most excited about, of course, seeing my feminist colleagues from throughout the world. I think we need to understand the personal level that these spaces give us for solidarity and also joint advocacy. So although we benefited from virtual meetings being possible, it's we need to get our lessons from that and move on, but continue with the physical meetings with the additions of the virtual space. What I'm most excited and hopeful, I can say hopeful about, is exactly being able to talk the intersectionalities between different issues, between gender equality and climate change and environment and disaster risk reduction. And I really hope that the agreed conclusions, the outcome documents will reflect it as such, rather than just looking into the gender equality issues within those. Because all of the points in climate change and disaster risk reduction, including those that seem to be very macro level, that seems to be very economic, are from the root connected to gender equality. So I think it will be important for member states not to shy away from talking about some of the discussions that continue from the COP 26 we had in Glasgow, because those issues continue and will affect, because women and girls bear the burden each time there's a crisis. We kind of hang it up and try to make life normal again, quote unquote, like in the COVID pandemic. And I think one thing I wanted to say um, to everyone is that as civil society, as feminist civil society, I would also like to uh, I would also hope that we'd be understood that we have high expectations of the UN. We realize that it's a multilateral space. We realize it's an intergovernmental space like in CSW. But um, the ideals UN is built upon, and therefore we hope its departments and its policy spaces can be spaces that are conducive to progressing rights and priorities, rather than being co-opted by, anti-gender and anti-rights groups that I mentioned about, that would regress our rights. Thank you.
If I can just briefly hop in here to answer your current question and to also kind of touch on your last question, I'm hopeful that there's greater recognition that women and girls are not a monolith, right? That there are women and girls who encounter multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, and that certain things impact them differently. So I think that gives me hope, because I'm hopeful that in our conversations at CSW, we acknowledge those differences and we talk about women and girls in all their diversity and not just only one subset of women, right? And then that brings me really to the little feedback that I have for the report card, which I think is a very useful tool. I would just encourage some of that intersectionality to be brought into focus in the report card in a more meaningful way. And I'm reminded of that because today in the US is Equal Pay Day. But that does not apply to women who look like me. It's the day, March 15th, in which a white woman would have to work all of 2021 and then up until this day in 2022 to make what a white man made in 2021. It is interesting that because of the COVID pandemic, the Equal Pay Day for Black women, for Native women, for Latinx women, and for AAPI women have all been pushed back to later in the year. So for instance, previously, Equal Pay Day for Black women was August 3rd, which is 5 months after May 15th. This year, groups estimate that it won't be until September 21st. So again, when we talk about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, just in one example, we can't talk about the impact of the COVID-19 on women broadly. We have to break it down because it has impacted different kinds of women differently. It has impacted women with disabilities in a different way than it's impacted Latinx women, in a different way that it's impacted Indigenous women, then a different way that it's impacted Black women. And that's not just true here in the US, although I use it as a microcosm, but it really is true globally. So I think it's important to continue to take that lens and apply it to our feminist work, because true feminism has to benefit all women in our diversity, not just one kind of woman.
Thank you so much, Desiree. Anybody else want to jump in?
I would just echo what has already been said. I think that I look forward to seeing colleagues and yeah, look forward to seeing colleagues that we've not been able to see for the last couple of years. I do think that there is, I think, to the point that was raised earlier about root causes and about the linkages between climate and gender. I think one of the interesting things that we are seeing at this year's CSW is that we are seeing not just the gender equality and ministries of women's affairs coming, we're actually seeing climate and environment ministers coming as well. And I think that's really critically important. So what I'm looking forward to us coming out of this with is a deeper understanding of the way in which gender inequality sits at the root of this existential crisis that we have on the climate emergency at the moment. And hopefully the agreed conclusions, yes, but hopefully beyond that, a greater awareness and realization of how these issues fit together.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nahla. I cannot thank you all enough for all the incredible comments that you've all raised. I think we've gotten such valuable feedback on improving our advocacy, working together collaboratively, and really how to understand and implement intersectionality, both as civil society, as government, as UN agencies. So thank you all again for the perspectives that you've offered. I hope this was a valuable discussion to those who joined us today. Thank you to the ICRW team compiling questions and tech support. Thank you to the Women's Major Group for co-sponsoring. So enjoy the rest of the CSW and take care.